The winter that buried Eldoria was the coldest in living memory. Snow piled against the walls of the Great Hall like the white hands of the dead, and the river that had once carried trade from the southern seas to the heart of the kingdom had frozen solid, a ribbon of black ice under a sky the color of iron. Prince Cailan stood at the window of his chamber, once his father's chamber, now a gilded cage, and watched the snow fall on a kingdom he no longer ruled. 6 months had passed since the fall. 6 months since his father had died on the battlefield, his sword still raised, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. 6 months since the Viking king, Magnus the Ruthless, had walked into the great hall of Eldoria and claimed it for his own. Cailan remembered that day as if it was still happening. The doors had been thrown open, and the cold had rushed in like a living thing, carrying with it the scent of blood and sea salt. Magnus had stood in the doorway, a giant of a man with silver hair and eyes the color of winter storms, and he had looked at Cailan as if he were a piece of furniture. "This kingdom is mine now," Magnus had said, his voice low and rough like stones grinding together. "But I have no use for a dead prince. Kneel, and I will let you live." Cailan had not knelt. He had stood with his back straight and his hands at his sides, and he had looked into the eyes of the man who had killed his father. "I will not kneel to you," he had said. "You may take my kingdom, but you will not take my dignity." Magnus had smiled at that, a thin, cold smile that did not reach his eyes. "Dignity," he had repeated as if tasting the word. "Dignity is a luxury for men who have something left to lose. You have nothing, boy, nothing but a name that no longer means anything, and a face that reminds me of a man I respected enough to kill quickly." He had stepped closer, close enough that Cailan could smell the leather and iron of him, the faint trace of the wine he had drunk at the victory feast. "I am going to give you a choice, not because you deserve one, because I am curious to see what you will do." That choice had brought Cailan to this moment, standing at the window of his father's chamber, watching the snow fall on a kingdom that had been carved up like a slaughtered beast. Magnus had offered him a bargain: marry his daughter, Signy, and live 6 months of every year in the north as a prince of the Viking court. In return, Magnus would return the southern half of Eldoria to Cailan's rule, and the Viking raiders would withdraw from his lands. The northern half would remain under Viking control, and Eldoria would pay tribute in food and gold each year. It was not freedom, it was not justice, it was a cage with a longer leash. But Cailan had said yes. He had said yes because his people were starving, because the fields had not been planted, because the winter would kill them all if he did not find a way to bring food from the north. He had said yes because his mother was still alive, hiding in a convent on the southern coast, and because the only way to keep her safe was to play the role Magnus had assigned him. He had said yes because he had no other choice. The door opened behind him, and he heard the heavy tread of boots on stone. He did not turn around. He knew who it was. "You are still staring at the snow," Magnus said. The Viking king moved to stand beside him at the window, his massive frame blocking the pale light. "It will not melt any faster for your watching." "I am not watching the snow," Cailan said. "I am watching my kingdom disappear beneath it." Magnus was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Your kingdom is not disappearing. It is changing. There is a difference." Cailan turned to look at him, and for the first time he allowed himself to really see the man who had destroyed his life. Magnus was older than he had appeared on the battlefield, his silver hair thin at the temples, his face lined with decades of command. There was a wariness in his eyes that Cailan had not noticed before, a weight that seemed to press down on his massive shoulders. He was dying. Cailan was sure of it. Not quickly, not obviously, but the signs were there, the way his breath came a little too fast after climbing the stairs, the way his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking. "Why me?" Cailan asked. "You have a dozen chieftains who would kill to marry your daughter. You have warriors who would die for a chance to sit on the throne of the north. Why offer it to me, a prisoner, an enemy, a man who has every reason to hate you?" Magnus turned to face him, and his cold eyes softened just slightly. "Because my daughter is not a prize to be won. She is a wolf cub, and wolves do not mate with sheep. The men who would kill to marry her are the same men who would kill her when I am gone. They want her throne. They want her power. They want the bloodline that runs through her veins. But you—" He paused, studying Kaelin's face. "You want nothing from her. You do not want her land, her title, or her army. You want only to go home, and that makes you the safest husband she could have." Kaelin stared at him. "You want me to marry your daughter so that I will not want her. I want you to marry my daughter so that you will protect her." Magnus's voice dropped, and for the first time, Kaelin heard something other than cold calculation. He heard fear. "I am dying, Kaelin. The healer says I have maybe a year, maybe less. When I am gone, the wolves will circle. They will try to tear her apart. They will try to take what is hers. And I need someone standing beside her who is not one of them, someone who has nothing to gain from her death, someone who is smart enough to see the traps they will lay and stubborn enough to refuse to spring them." Kaelin felt something shift in his chest. He had spent 6 months hating this man, dreaming of revenge, imagining the day when he would watch Magnus die. But now, standing in the gray winter light, listening to a dying king beg for his daughter's safety, he found that the hatred was not as clean as it had once been. "You killed my father," he said. "You burned my kingdom, and now you ask me to save your daughter?" Magnus nodded. "Yes, because you are the only one who can." The journey north took 3 weeks. Kaelin traveled with Magnus and a retinue of Viking warriors through mountains that scraped the sky and across frozen rivers that glittered like sheets of hammered silver. The cold was worse than anything he had imagined. It seeped through his woolen cloaks and leather boots, finding the gaps in his armor settling into his bones like a sickness. The Vikings did not seem to notice. They laughed and drank and told stories of battles and raids, and Kaelin sat apart from them, watching the landscape change, wondering what kind of people could call this frozen wasteland home. On the 10th night, they stopped at a small settlement in the shadow of a glacier. Magnus built a fire and sat beside Kaelin, offering him a cup of mead. Kaelin took it more for the warmth than for the drink. "You are afraid," Magnus said. It was not a question. "I am cold," Kaelin replied. "Cold and afraid are the same thing in the north. The cold teaches you to be afraid, and the fear teaches you to survive." Magnus stared into the flames, his silver hair catching the firelight. "My daughter was born in the middle of a blizzard. The healer said she would not live through the night, but she did. She has been surviving ever since. Surviving the cold, surviving the raids, surviving the men who look at her like she is a piece of meat." He turned to look at Kaelin, and his eyes were dark with something that might have been grief. "She is not like you. She is not soft. She will not thank you for protecting her. She will fight you every step of the way. But do not let that fool you. She is more afraid than you are. She has just had longer to learn how to hide it." Kaelin did not know what to say. He had spent his whole life learning how to read people, how to find the weaknesses behind their masks, but Magnus was a puzzle he could not solve. A killer who spoke of his daughter with tenderness. A conqueror who asked for mercy. A dying man who had no right to ask for anything. "I will protect her," Kaelin said finally. "Not because you asked me, not because I owe you anything, but because no one deserves to face the wolves alone." Magnus nodded, and for a moment the hardness in his face softened. "That is why I chose you," he said. "That is why I knew you would say yes." Signy was waiting for them in the great hall of Jotunheim, the fortress that Magnus had built at the edge of the world. She stood at the far end of the hall, her back straight, her hands clasped in front of her, her blonde hair falling in a single braid over her shoulder. She was tall for a woman, almost as tall as Kaelin, with broad shoulders and arms that looked like they had swung an axe more than once. Her eyes were the same pale blue as her father's, but where Magnus's eyes were cold, hers were hot, burning with a fury that she did not bother to hide. "So you are the prince," she said, her voice flat. "The one who could not save his kingdom and now comes to beg for scraps from ours." Kaelin felt the insult land like a slap, but he did not flinch. "I am the prince who is trying to save what remains of his people," he said. "If that means making a bargain with your father, then so be it. I did not come here to be liked." Signy's eyes narrowed. "Good, because you will not be." She turned to her father, and her voice was sharp. "This is a mistake. He is weak. He cannot protect himself, let alone me. You are giving me to a man who cannot even hold his own sword." Magnus raised a hand, and Signy fell silent. "He is not weak," Magnus said quietly. "He is different. There is a difference. You will learn to see it, or you will learn to regret your blindness." He turned to Kaelin. "You will stay in the East Wing. Signy will show you to your quarters. Tomorrow, we will discuss the wedding." Signy did not wait for Kaelin to follow. She turned on her heel and walked out of the hole, her boots echoing on the stone floor. Kaelin hesitated for just a moment, then followed her into the shadows. The days that followed were the longest of Kaelin's life. Signy did not speak to him unless she had to, and when she did, her words were sharp as broken glass. She showed him the East Wing with cold efficiency, pointed to the bed where he would sleep, the table where he would eat, the door that led to the bathhouse. She did not ask if he was comfortable. She did not ask if he needed anything. She treated him like an inconvenience, a chore that had been assigned to her without her consent. Kaelin did not push. He had learned long ago that you could not force someone to trust you. You could only show them, day by day, that you were worthy of trust. So he kept to himself, explored the fortress on his own, learned the names of the servants and the gods. He helped in the kitchens when they were short-handed, mended the nets in the fishing village at the base of the cliff, and sat with the old women who told stories of the old gods while they spun wool by the fire. He did not try to impress anyone. He simply tried to be useful. On the 7th night, he found Signy in the practice yard, alone, swinging an axe at a wooden post. The post had been hacked to splinters, but she kept swinging, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her face streaked with sweat and tears. Kaelin stood at the edge of the yard watching, and when she finally stopped, her chest heaving, he stepped forward. "You are angry," he said. She whirled on him, the axe still in her hand, her eyes wild. "I am not angry. I am furious. My father is dying. He is giving me to a stranger, and I am supposed to be grateful because the stranger is not a murderer." She laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "Do you know how many men have asked for my hand? Do you know how many of them looked at me like I was a door they needed to unlock? You are no different. You want my father's favor. You want his army. You want—" "I want nothing from you," Kaelin said, and his voice was quiet but firm. "I did not ask for this. I did not want this, but I made a promise to your father, and I will keep it. Not because I care about you, not because I care about him, because I am a man who keeps his promises." Signy stared at him, the axe trembling in her hand, and then, slowly, she lowered it. "Why did you say yes?" she asked. "You could have refused. You could have died with your kingdom. Why did you choose to live?" Kaelin looked at her, at the fury and the fear and the grief that she was trying so hard to hide. "Because my people are still alive," he said. "Because if I had died, they would have had no one. Because sometimes living is harder than dying, and the only way to honor the dead is to keep living." Something flickered in Signy's eyes, something that might have been understanding. "My mother used to say that," she said quietly. "Before she died, she said that the dead do not need our tears. They need our memories. They need us to keep going." Kaelin nodded. "She sounds like she was wise." Signy's lips curved into something that was almost a smile. She was also the only person my father ever feared. She looked down at the axe in her hand, then back at Kaelin. "I will not make this easy for you. I will not pretend to be your wife. But I will not be your enemy, not unless you give me a reason." Kaelin held out his hand. "Then let us stop there. Not as enemies, not as husband and wife, as allies." Signy looked at his hand for a long moment. Then she took it. Her grip was firm, her palm rough with calluses, and when their hands met, Kaelin felt something pass between them. Not warmth, not affection, but a spark of something that might one day grow into respect. The wedding was held on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. The great hall of Jotunheim was packed with chieftains and warriors, their faces painted with symbols of the old gods, their voices raised in songs that Kaelin did not understand. A fire burned in the center of the hall, so large that the smoke rose to the rafters and curled out through the vents in the roof. The air was thick with the smell of roasting meat and mead and sweat. Kaelin stood at the altar, dressed in the clothes of a Viking prince, a tunic of dark wool, a cloak of white fur, a silver brooch shaped like a raven on his shoulder. He felt like a fraud, a pretender wearing a costume that did not fit. But he held his head high and kept his eyes on the door, waiting for Signy to appear. She came in on her father's arm, dressed in a gown of deep blue that matched her eyes. Her hair was loose, falling over her shoulders like a waterfall of gold, and on her head she wore a crown of silver and amber. She did not look at the crowd. She looked only at Kaelin, and her expression was unreadable. When she reached the altar, Magnus placed her hand in Kaelin's and stepped back. The priest, a grizzled old man with runes tattooed on his face, began to speak in the old tongue, and Kaelin caught only every third word. But he understood the meaning. He was being bound to Signy, not just in this life, but in the next. His fate was now tied to hers, and hers to his. "Do you accept this woman as your wife?" The priest asked in the common tongue for Kaelin's sake. "Do you swear to protect her, to honor her, to stand beside her against all enemies?" Kaelin looked at Signy, and for a moment the whole disappeared. There was only her, standing before him with her blue eyes burning, her jaw set, her hands trembling just slightly. She was afraid. She was so afraid, and she was trying so hard not to show it. And in that moment, Kaelin made a choice. Not the choice Magnus had forced on him, not the choice of a prisoner or a pawn. His own choice. "I accept her," he said, and his voice was steady. "I swear to protect her, to honor her, to stand beside her, not because I am bound to, because I choose to." Signy's eyes widened just for an instant, then she looked away, and the ceremony continued. The feast that followed was a blur of noise and drink and laughter. Kaelin sat at the high table beside Signy, and they ate in silence while the warriors told stories of battles and raids. Magnus sat at the head of the table, watching them both with an expression that was impossible to read. He did not eat much. He did not drink. He simply watched and waited, and Kaelin understood that he was being judged. When the feast was over and the hall had emptied, Signy led Kaelin to her chambers. Their chambers now. The room was warm, lit by candles that flickered in the draught from the window, and the bed was piled high with furs. Signy stood in the center of the room, her back to him, her hands clasped in front of her. "You do not have to stay," she said. "No one will know if you sleep in the east wing." Kaelin closed the door behind him. "I know," he said, "but I made a promise." Signy turned to face him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I do not want your pity," she said. "I do not want your duty. I want—" She stopped, her voice breaking. "I do not know what I want." Kaelin walked toward her slowly, giving her time to step back if she wanted to. She did not move. When he was close enough to see the freckles on her nose, the small scar above her eyebrow, the way her breath caught in her throat, he stopped. "You do not have to know," he said. "Neither do I, but we have time. We have the rest of our lives to figure it out." He reached out and took her hand, and she did not pull away. "I am not your enemy, Signy. I am not your savior. I am just a man who is trying to do the right thing. And right now, the right thing is to be here, with you." Signy looked at their joined hands, and a single tear slid down her cheek. "My father was right about you," she whispered. "You are not like the others. I hope that is a good thing." She laughed, a small, wet sound. "I do not know yet, but I am willing to find out." Months passed. The winter gave way to a brief, cold spring, and then to a summer that was warmer than any Kaelin had expected. He and Signy fell into a rhythm, a careful dance of respect and distance that slowly began to close. They ate together, walked together along the cliffs, sat together by the fire in the great hall, while the warriors told their stories. They learned each other's habits, each other's silences, each other's small kindnesses. And somewhere along the way, without either of them noticing, the distance began to shrink. In the autumn, Magnus fell ill. The sickness that had been eating at him for years finally took hold, and he took to his bed, too weak to rise. Signy sat by his side day and night, holding his hand, wiping his brow, refusing to leave. Kaelin brought her food, brought her water, sat with her in the darkness when the candles burned low. He did not try to comfort her with words, he simply stayed. On the third night, Magnus opened his eyes and looked at Kaelin. His gaze was clear, sharper than it had been in weeks, and when he spoke, his voice was steady. "You have kept your promise," Magnus said. "You have protected her." Kaelin nodded. I will continue to protect her. Magnus's lips curved into a smile. I know. That is why I chose you. He turned his head to look at Signy, and his eyes softened. You are stronger than you know, my daughter. Stronger than I ever was. But strength without wisdom is just violence. He has wisdom, let him teach you. He reached out and took Signy's hand, pressing it into Kaelin's. Take care of each other. That is all I ask. He closed his eyes, and his breathing slowed. By morning, he was gone. Signy did not cry at the funeral. She stood at the edge of the fjord, watching as her father's body was placed on a longship and sent out to sea, the arrows of his warriors setting it ablaze. The flames rose high, turning the water to gold, and the smoke curled toward the sky like a prayer. Kaelin stood beside her, and when the ship finally sank beneath the waves, he put his hand on her shoulder. She leaned into him just slightly, and he felt her tremble. I am alone now, she whispered. No, he said. You are not. The chieftains gathered in the Great Hall the next day to confirm Signy as the new ruler of the Northern Alliance. Most of them accepted her without question. But a few, led by a scarred warrior named Jarl Orm, whispered of the old ways, of the need for a king, not a queen, of the danger of a woman on the throne. Signy stood before them, her back straight, her hand on the hilt of her sword. I am my father's daughter, she said. I have fought beside you. I have bled for you. I have earned the right to lead you. If any man here doubts that, let him step forward and prove me wrong. The hall was silent. Orm shifted in his seat, but he did not stand. No one did. Kaelin stepped forward to stand beside Signy, and when he spoke, his voice was calm and clear. I am not a Viking. I do not pray to your gods. I do not sing your songs. But I have watched you, and I have learned from you, and I have come to respect you. Signy is not just a queen. She is a warrior. She is a leader. She is the future of the North. If you cannot see that, you are blind, and the blind have no place in a world that is already too dark. The chieftains stared at him, and then, one by one, they bowed their heads. Orm was the last, and his bow was grudging, but he bowed. That night, Signy stood with Kaelin on the cliffs above the fjord, watching the northern lights dance across the sky. The colors were like nothing Kaelin had ever seen, green and purple and gold, shifting and swirling, as if the heavens themselves were alive. You spoke well today, Signy said. The chieftains were impressed. I was not trying to impress them, Kaelin said. I was telling the truth. Signy turned to look at him, and in the light of the aurora her eyes were the color of the sea. My father was right about you, she said. You are not like the others. You never were. Kaelin looked at her, at the woman who had been a stranger, then an enemy, then an ally, and now something he did not yet have a name for. I did not come here to be like anyone, he said. I came here to keep a promise, and I have kept it. Signy reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. You have, she said, but promises are not the only thing that bind people. Sometimes it is something else, something that grows slowly, without you noticing, until one day you realize that you cannot imagine your life without it. Kaelin felt his heart beat faster. And what is that? Signy smiled, and it was the first real smile he had seen from her. I do not know the word for it yet, but I am willing to find out. They stood on the cliffs until the aurora faded, and the stars came out, and the sea whispered its ancient songs below. Kaelin thought of his father, dead on the battlefield. He thought of his mother, waiting in the convent on the southern coast. He thought of the kingdom he had lost, the kingdom he might never see again, and he thought of the woman beside him, who had been given to him as a bargain and had become something more. He did not know what the future would bring. He did not know if the peace would hold, if the chieftains would stay loyal, if the wolves would come circling when the memory of Magnus faded. But he knew one thing, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones and warmed him more than any fire ever could. He was not alone. He had never been alone, and he would never be alone again. The snow began to fall, soft and silent, dusting the cliffs and the fjord and the rooftops of the settlement below. Kaelin pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders, and Signy leaned into him, and together they watched the winter return to the land that had become their home. A fallen kingdom, Kaelin said quietly. A captive prince, a dangerous bargain. He looked at Signy, and his lips curved into a smile. It sounds like the beginning of a song. Sydney laughed, and the sound was warm and real. "Then let us write it," she said, "together."